Okay, good evening. Welcome to our third lecture in this year's four-part series, presented by the Architects Association of Santa Cruz County and Habitat for Humanity Santa Cruz County. Tonight's event is sponsored by Red Tree Properties. The Delaware Addition is a prime example of what a community-centered property can do. It reflects a creative design, patient development process, and social values. Tonight we have Craig French, Managing Director, and Carl Rice here with us. Guys?
Hello.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, tonight we're proud to present one of our own Architects Association members. Mark Primack came to Santa Cruz in 1976. He has served on the Santa Cruz City Council, the Zoning Board, the Historic Preservation Commission, and after the 1989 earthquake, he served on the city's Vision Santa Cruz Committee. He contributed one of the 7 prototype plans for the accessory dwelling unit published by the City of Santa Cruz. He spent 30 years shaping our community. Please welcome Mark Primack.
Thank you, and thank you for coming tonight. I have a lot of slides, a lot of information I'd like to share with you. I'm not sure how quickly I can get through it, so please bear with me. And I'd like to start by asking the people here a question. And there's no judgment to this, but I'm really curious as to how many people in this room were actually born in Santa Cruz County. So if you could just raise your hand if you were born in Santa Cruz County. Okay, we have, that's actually a fairly good showing. And I bring that up because I wasn't born in Santa Cruz County. I came here from someplace else. And I think we all who have come here brought something with us. Someone might call it baggage, but I think we bring something here, we mix it in with what we find here, and I think the place is richer for that. And I know that happened, and I think we're richer for that too. And I know that happened with me, and I want to, because this is an architects gathering, I want to get a little bit behind the scenes and talk about where the design came from, what led to this design, and its evolution. And so I hope you'll bear with me on that. This is what I brought to Santa Cruz. I studied architecture at an art school, and the ideal was to have your studio, a place where where there's no separation between living and working. Your work was your life. If you were lucky, you had an environment that was both familiar to you and challenging to you. And so that's what I brought here when I came. And what I did before I came here was on the very fringe of architecture. My thesis was called Botanic Architecture, and it had to do with the notion of growing trees to create architecture. These days, that's known as an emergent technology or biomimicry. There are departments in schools that follow those lines, but there was no name for it back in 1973 and 4 when I was working on this. But these were illustrations to this thesis in which I talked about high technology involved in agriculture as opposed to technology evolving out of living plants. Coupled with that were readings in the early writers of environmental design. Ian McCarg, who was the father of environmental design, a Scotsman, wrote a book called Design with Nature in the 60s. And there was a quote there where he talked about the Depression in Scotland, and he said, I think everybody could read this, but I'm just going to read it quickly. Indeed, during the Depression, there were many young men who would not submit to the indignity of the dole or its cues, and who chose to live off the land, selling their strength where they could for food and poaching when they could not, sleeping in the bracken or a shepherd's bothy in good weather, living in hostels and public libraries in winter. They found independence, came to know the land, and live from it, and sustain their spirit. So I combined botanic architecture and that quote into a project for the Greenbelt around London. London has a boundary to growth. Anybody living in London can get on public transportation. In 20 minutes, they can be in fields and forest. And my vision in 1975 was that the large cities of the world would crumble under their own weight, and in that process, the technocrats and the scientists would come out out to the Greenbelt, and they would build a framework of biodegradable material in which were set hybrid tree vines that would grow to supplant, to get nourishment from those, from that framework, and to replace it, and to create the frame of a new city, a living city. And as the city of London deteriorated, the homeless would leave the city and find shelter in the Greenbelt, and they would become the gardeners, the horticulturalists, and the people who would eventually create a living city to supplant and replace the city of London. I brought that to Santa Cruz and met three people, Paige Smith, Paul Lee, and Roy Rydell. I'd been given their names before I left London, and I thought I'd stop here for a short time, but they held me here in Santa Cruz. They were people who had many things in common. They came from someplace else to Santa Cruz. They did work that reached outside of Santa Cruz. They were deeply engaged in this community, and they were all married to very strong women who, with them, had created what Paige Stegner referred to as deeply lived-in homes. And Paul Lee saw the work I did on the Greenbelt in London and said that Santa Cruz needed one of those, and put me to work drawing a tree, the crucifixion oak and Pogonip, as part of a poster to protest the potential development of Pogonip and to present the concept of a Greenbelt around London. The wonderful thing about living in Santa Cruz in the mid to late 70s is, I can't believe I'm saying this, but housing was cheap, and you didn't need to make much to get by. And for $10, you could become a friend of the university library and have full library access. And so I was a lot cheaper than grad school. So I did my research at the library for articles that I was writing on botanic architecture. And through Roy Rydell, I discovered that there had been another botanic architect in Santa Cruz long before I got here, a man named Axel Erlandson, who had never finished the 4th grade but knew more about growing architecture than I will ever know. And he had created a place called the Tree Circus in Scotts Valley. And my research told me that he was unique in the world, in the history of horticulture. And I stayed in Santa Cruz to document the work that he had done. And in the process, I got better at drawing trees, and researched his life, and in that process settled into Santa Cruz. And the work I did on documenting Erlandson's work informed the work that I would later do in terms of extending my concepts of this botanic architecture. But also from Roy and Paige and Paul, I learned activism and got involved in trying to save the trees. And some of you might recognize some of the players in this circle who were willing to trespass to water and weed on land that was slated for development. And eventually, those efforts led to some of those trees being saved, not here in Santa Cruz, moved to Gilroy, but those trees still exist. I also got involved in various competitions. This one for a site in Paris, and it gave me an opportunity to think about urban design. And part of the program for this particular competition had to do with creating buildings in Paris, among other things, that were meant to maintain what was referred to as the fabric of Paris. And so if you look at this montage that includes an aerial of the neighborhood that this site was in, and then you look at this plan, you see at the top and the bottom and around on the right-hand side the fabric of Paris, which is easily defined by blocks and property lines. And those property lines and those blocks represented the party walls, because the buildings were built right next to each other. And they were all oddly configured, but they also allowed for interior courtyards, which allowed these buildings to have natural light and ventilation penetrate to the rears of all the buildings. And so my way of designing in the fabric of Paris was not to decide which period of architecture I wanted to mimic, but to simply insert into the yet-to-be-built area blocks of party walls. And you can see here my design. There was no facade. There was no exterior wall. It was like basically saying, here are 70 properties, 7 stories, as are the outlying blocks in the photograph, and hire 70 architects. And no matter what they design, you'll be maintaining the fabric of Paris. And so I became interested in the bones of a city, what it was, because, and in fact, I turned this into an article that was published in the early 80s, and the title of the article was a quote from Victor Hugo, who, writing about this area many centuries, as it appeared many centuries ago, spoke of a wall behind which something is happening. And basically saying that the wall is not nearly as important as the activity and the culture that takes place behind that wall. And so I've been a student of the bones of cities since then, and how configurations change, how spaces are created by the first lines that are put on the piece of paper, the lines of how you lay out the streets and how you lay out building lots, and the density that's created, the vertical density, the vertical plan of a city, and also what people are allowed to do to express themselves and to express their lives and to live their lives. And speaking of walls behind which something is happening, this is not the prettiest wall. It's in Lower Manhattan. But behind this wall are the best bagels and bialys in all of Manhattan. I had just driven over from Brooklyn with a host for the purpose of picking up breakfast. And I don't think people in Manhattan particularly care what the facade of that building looks like, as long as the business behind it and the product that they create continues there. The same is true of this building in Cape Cod. The culture and the heritage of this community lives on inside the structure, and I doubt that anybody cares about the font of the sign on the building or even the materials of the building. But this is a prized location in this particular community for what it represents. I lived for a time in this building, which overlooks City Hall. We lived in 526 square feet, my wife and I, and we lived there until my daughter was 4 and my wife was pregnant with our second child. And we still remember this space very fondly, and sometimes we pine for Pine Place at our household. We learned about living in tight spaces, but we also learned about living among other people in the community that grows from that. An early project of mine was Silver Birches, where there was an existing house, and we arranged 3 houses around that existing house, and they were huge. They were 800 square feet, 900 square feet, and the largest one at the end was 1,100 square feet. But more importantly, the design was meant to be compatible with the Eisant house, a historic house on the site. And so we referenced that building and recycled old windows and doors, and learned to be a scavenger on this job. But most importantly, were the communal spaces that we arranged the buildings and gave second position to cars, so that we could actually create spaces where people who live there could come together, and in this case, or even host events where that sense of community could be accommodated. As Jim said, for some of us, the earthquake was kind of a turning point and a milestone in our lives and our careers. I had just moved out of downtown when the earthquake happened, and I had just gotten my architectural license before the earthquake happened. And so I became involved in downtown rebuilding, but just as importantly, this is a view of the old county bank building, what was left of it, 2 walls propped up. The St. George was gone. One of the first downtown buildings just next to, on Cooper Street, across Cooper Street here, where Gravago is now, the first reconstruction had just taken place, and Jen and I had just moved back downtown as the first office tenants to move back in after the earthquake. So this was the environment that we worked in for some time while the street was being rebuilt, literally, and new buildings were coming in. And as Jim said, I was involved with Vision Santa Cruz, and it's a fascinating time when the decisions have to be made of, do you take broken buildings and patch them, piece them back together, save them, or do you start fresh? And so that's been an ongoing interest of mine of how a city renews itself, rebuilds itself, and there are times when it's not an either-or situation. Some people might say that this is disrespectful of a historic structure. This is the Chelsea Market in Manhattan, a very vibrant place, but it also reflects a kind of vibrancy of imagination, where people are willing to take the bones of an old building and make it new, and keep it alive. And then, of course, examples this is from Istanbul. Stuart Brand wrote a book called How Buildings Learn, and he talked about how buildings change over time and adapt to new technologies, new needs, new inhabitants. And I love this because this is a building in which walls have become windows, and you look further up and you see windows that have become walls, and the building lives on as it adapts to the needs of the people there. And then a space that at one point was probably a repair garage for trucks or automobiles is now a gallery in New York and in Chelsea, and at some point it may be a garage again. One of the things I love about cities is that there's this sense of anticipation. Buildings go up, walls, party walls are quickly plastered and roughly plastered in anticipation of the next building that would go next to it. And sometimes that happens in 6 months, and sometimes that happens in 60 years. And sometimes the residents of the first building get impatient and knock holes in the wall so they can have windows for light and air, and it's all kind of interim architecture. But it's a way that a city continues to breathe as it grows and changes and fits and starts. Istanbul has a whole culture around, it's known as smuggled stories, where the popular belief is that if you can enclose a space before you're busted, you can't be forced to take it down. And so the skyline of Istanbul is marked by these smuggled stories, where there are buildings and with these stories added to meet the needs of the people who live there. And it's an incredibly vibrant city, but you feel that kind of anarchic exuberance when you're there. The old county bank building that we saw the 2 walls of, I was involved in bringing a software company down to downtown Santa Cruz after the earthquake, and the space between where my office was built and where Gravago is and the county bank building, there had been a narrow building there, but my client worked with the owner, Barry Swenson, of the county bank building to purchase that property so that it could be left open, and so that there could be 3 rather than 2 walls of the county bank building that were exposed and could have light and windows and air, which made the county bank building, its new life, much more livable in that there were far more spaces that could have access to natural light. And some of you may remember the little building that went in the front was, rather than putting up a 6-foot wall, we put up a little kiosk, and anti-glass moved in originally, and it gave privacy to this courtyard. And people who were around post-earthquake might recognize in the arbor on my left, your left as well, when you look at the screen, an arbor there. The wooden top part of that arbor was actually the entry canopy to Bookshop Santa Cruz tent for a number of years before they moved back into a building. So we kind of recycled history into this courtyard. And now, of course, the restaurant Lele is there, and you can dine in this courtyard. But for years, many people didn't even know that it existed. The space upstairs that the software company moved into, that is now Next Space, my client there actually cared about the people who worked there and wanted to create a sense of community. And whereas the shell that was put up immediately after the earthquake, so that the exterior walls would be supported, the shell was designed for your standard acoustical drop ceiling and your rabbit warren of private offices. Instead, we put the foam insulation on the roof so that we could leave the entire structure open and create a community of spaces and for that software company. And when that software company sold to Cisco, and Cisco announced that they were moving everybody over the hill to their campus, the people who worked there refused to leave. And so Cisco had no choice but to live out the lease there and let their workers stay working in the town that they all lived in. And the space was successful enough that and congenial enough that when Next Space, a co-working environment, moved in, they had to do very little to adapt to this space. And so, whereas in your traditional office, between tenants, you would go in with a bobcat and basically bulldoze everything and then put it back. The materials and the work and the workmanship that went into this space was able to have a second and third life. I continue to work with this notion of working space. It's another co-working environment that we're working on right now for the tannery. But the idea of what does it take to